Hello, and welcome to another exciting session of Ask a BA. In this session, we'll be looking at part 2 of business analyst interview questions and answers using the STAR method. We'll begin with an introduction and where we'll give you an overview of the STAR method, which stands for situation, task, action, and results. And then we'll be showcasing 12 example business analyst questions and answers. Together with part 1, it will make a total of 24 business analyst questions and answers. If not had a chance to look at the first part, this is probably a very good opportunity to have a look at part 1. We'll go right into the questions. Now, suppose you've been given a question or asked a question at an interview and it says, describe a time when you had to create a process map or workflow to solve a business problem. Now, if you break this question into your STAR method, the situation can be a conflict between two departments. And then your task will be to resolve this conflict and align the teams. In this case, you are trying to use a process map to help bring the understanding. And your action here will be you hold structured discussions, mapped the process maps, and get a consensus across both teams. The result then is that the conflict was resolved, the project moved forward on schedule. Let's go straight now to answer this question if you were asked in an interview. You can say, in my previous role, I identified that the company's invoicing process was inefficient, leading to delayed payment and customer dissatisfaction. My task there was I was asked with creating a process map to identify the inefficiencies and then to propose improvements to streamline the invoicing workflow. What I did to resolve this was I worked with the finance and sales team to map out the entire invoicing process, identifying bottlenecks where approvals or data entry were delayed. I then used the flowchart tool. In particular, I used Visio to visualize the steps and areas for improvement. I then suggested automating repetitive tasks and reducing manual approvals by implementing an integrated software system. The result was that the new process reduced the invoicing cycle time by 50% and customer complaints regarding delayed invoices decreased significantly. And this led to faster payment processing and improved cash flow. Now, let's say you were given another question, and this has to do with working with a large volume of information. Again, like in the previous one, you can try and break that question into your STAR method. So you identify the situation, the task, the action, and the result. So let's say in this case, the question was, tell me about a time when you had to deliver a complex report to senior management. How did you ensure clarity and impact? We'll go next to answer the question. Just a quick caution. After this question, I'll be asking the question and going right into the answers. You can, in your spare time, look at the breakdown of the question into situation, task, action, and results so that that can help you form that way of answering questions where you can easily break the questions into those parts. So let's go into answering this question. Tell me about a time when you had to deliver a complex report to senior management. How did you ensure clarity and impact? The situation was that during a project to assess the performance of our new CRM system, I was asked to deliver a complex report to ensure senior management and to help senior management highlighting both the successes and challenges. My task was to analyze the system performance data and present the findings in a way that senior management could easily understand. making sure the key takeaways were clear and actionable. It was a large data set to look through, and I knew from experience that senior stakeholders did not like to be bogged down with too many information. So my action in this situation was I summarized the findings into key metrics, focusing on KPIs that aligned with the company's goals. I used charts and visualizations to highlight the trends, such as customer engagement rates and conversions improvements. I included an executive summary to ensure that even senior management didn't read the entire report. They could grasp the key points quickly. The result was that the report was well received and management praised my ability to simplify complex data into actionable insights. The CRM system was fine tuned based on the recommendation, resulting in a 10% increase in user adoption within 3 months. Now, give me an example of a time when you had to facilitate a difficult discussion between team members or stakeholders. This situation occurred during a project where there was a disagreement between the marketing and development team about the scope of a new website feature. The marketing team wanted to add several new functionalities, while the developers were concerned about technical feasibility and timeline. My task in this particular project was to facilitate a discussion to resolve the conflict and ensure that both teams were aligned on the scope and timeline. I then arranged a meeting with both teams where both teams could voice their concerns. I carefully selected my audience. I carefully selected the stakeholders that were going to be in this meeting. And then I encouraged each side to present their reasoning while keeping the conversation focused on finding a balanced solution. After listening to both sides, I suggested a phased approach. The marketing team's priority features would be implemented first, and additional features would be added later based on user feedback. Both teams agreed on the phased approach, and the project moved forward smoothly. The initial launch was on time, and the additional features were rolled out in subsequent updates, resulting in a successful website launch that met both teams' objectives. This question is around identifying business opportunities. Now, can you tell me about the time when you identified a risk in a project? What was the risk and how did you handle it? The situation where this occurred was in a project where we had to roll out a new customer portal. I identified that a key integration with the payment gateway was at risk due to unresolved technical issues. My task then was to mitigate this risk and ensure that the integration would be completed on time or to adjust the project timeline accordingly. What I did was I immediately escalated the issue to the technical team and the leads as well, and I worked with them to prioritize troubleshooting the integration. I also communicated with the project manager to update the project timeline, ensuring that the launch date was feasible, even if the integration faced delays. I then proposed a backup plan where we would launch the portal with limited functionality and add payment capabilities in the later phase. In other words, I was using agile thinking. The result was that the technical team resolved the issues in time for the launch and were able to go live as planned. The contingency plan also allowed for a seamless transition when the payment gateway integration was completed and the launch was considered a success. This is a further question around resolving team conflicts. Can you describe a time when you had to handle a challenge in project scope? How did you manage it? The situation where this occurred was while I was working on a software development project. The client requested additional features midway through the project, which caused an increase in scope and complexity. My task was to assess the impact of these changes on the project timeline and resources, and then manage the client expectations accordingly. What I had to do in this scenario was I first assessed the new feature requested by the client and determined how they would affect the current scope and timeline. I created an updated project plan with new milestones and resource requirements. I worked with the project management to be able to with the project manager to be able to achieve this. I then met with the client to discuss the impact of these changes, explaining how the additional features would extend the timeline and would also require extra resources. The client understood the situation and agreed to this updated plan. The project was successfully completed with the additional features, and the client was satisfied with the final product, even though the timeline was adjusted. One good lesson I learned from this was that it was very, very important to keep the communication lines between the business and the clients so that even when project timelines need to change, as far as the clients are aware of it upfront, they are usually very acceptable to changes like this. Okay, can you tell me about a time when you had to prioritize competitive tasks with tight deadlines? Now, I want you to understand carefully that in this particular situation, part of your issue might be you were dealing with underperforming team members because they affect the entire delivery of the project. Um, in a previous role, I worked on multiple projects simultaneously, each with tight deadlines and competing priorities. My task was to prioritize this task and ensure that I met all the deadlines without compromising quality. Interestingly, one of the things I had to do in this particular project was I also had an underperforming team member, and I had to also prioritize this alongside the other activities that had to be carried out in the project. My action again in this particular situation was firstly, I assessed the urgency and importance of each task. Was dealing with the underperforming staff more important than the some of the other activities that we had, or did we have enough resources to be able to meet this task, and then I could deal with the staff member separately. So, like I said, I had to assess the urgency and importance of each task, taking into account stakeholder impact and project dependencies. I then use the project management tool to track progress and ensure that I allocated enough time for each task. I communicated regularly with stakeholders to keep them updated on progress and made adjustments when necessary to ensure I could meet the deadlines. I was working very closely with the project manager in this particular project. Part of the interesting things with this project was because I was also acting as the BA lead, I had a lot of project management responsibilities to deal with and then to align with my project manager. The result in this particular case was by carefully prioritizing and managing my time and team, I was able to complete all tasks on schedule and the projects were delivered successfully, meeting both the quality standards and deadlines. Can you tell me about a time when you had to work with limited information to make decisions? And part of this limited information also comes along with not getting enough information from stakeholders because some stakeholders were difficult. Um, the situation in this particular case was during a project, I was tasked with selecting a third party vendor for a critical component. But I didn't have enough detailed information about the vendor's capabilities. This was the situation. My task there now was to make a decision on which vendor to select based on the limited available information. I quickly gathered all the available data that was available to me by doing a lot of desk research and looking at previous reports. And then I also had to include vendor proposals, previous case studies, and references. I also reached out to colleagues who had worked with the vendor to gain insights into their experience. Additionally, I conducted a risk assessment based on the potential vendor's reputation and alignment with our requirements. As part of reaching out to colleagues, I also reached out to similar organizations that were similar to the one I was working with. In particular, in this particular situation, I was working with the local authority, so there were other local authorities who were who I could describe as complementary, and they were sympathetic also, and were willing to share information. So by being able to quickly assess the body of knowledge they already had about the vendors, it was very easy for me to be able to um, come up with a risk assessment based on the available information. The result of it all was I made an informed decision that led to the selection of a vendor who was able to deliver the required components on time. The project moved forward smoothly, and the vendor's performance exceeded expectation. Okay, can you describe a time when you had to collaborate with a team to solve a complex business problem? And in doing this, you also had to manage your stakeholders' expectations because the, the problem was complex. Okay, at my last job, the sales team were facing difficulties in tracking leads, which was impacting the conversion rate. The problem required collaboration across sales, marketing, and IT. Um, my task as a business analyst here was with leading the collaboration to identify the root cause and propose a solution. What I did was I facilitated a series of meetings with the sales, marketing, and IT teams to understand their pain points from their different perspectives. I also helped the teams identify key issues in the CRM system, and I proposed an integrated solution that would automatically capture and prioritize leads. I worked with IT to develop the necessary integration and ensured the marketing team provided the right content for the new lead tracking system. What was most valuable in this project was the fact that as a business analyst, I could act as the bridge between the technology and the business areas. And the breadth of knowledge which business analysis provides also made it possible for me to have some knowledge across the different areas. And the different stakeholders felt comfortable speaking with me because I could interpret their requirements clearly into IT terms, and vice versa. I could communicate from the IT perspective to their to improve their understanding. The result was that the solution improved lead tracking by 40% and boosted the conversion rate by 15%. The sales team reported higher satisfaction with the new system, which streamlined their workflow. Okay, tell me about a time when you solved a problem that wasn't clearly defined. Thank you. In the past project, leadership complained about poor adoption of a new internal tool, but no one could articulate the exact issue. What I had to do, my task in this particular situation, was to define the problem clearly and recommend actions. It's interesting because for most business analysis roles, in fact, you could say for all business analysis roles, one of the major um, one of the major things that a business analyst needs to do is to clearly define a problem, because that helps to define the solution for this problem. So what I did, to be able to clearly define this problem, was I interviewed staff. I also observed their workflow, and I also analyzed their usage logs. I used techniques like the 5 why analysis, and I found out that the real issue wasn't the tool. It was in fact the lack of onboarding and unclear benefits. I then rewrote the problem statement, designed a short training guide, and created communication plans explaining the value of the tool. The result was that adoption increased from 45% to 85% within 2 months, and the tool became standard practice. Okay. Can you give me an example when you validated requirements to prevent future defects? All right, the situation where this occurred was during the portal upgrade, the requirements collected informally were unclear, and there were also missing edge cases. I needed to validate the requirement before development started to avoid rework. What I did was I organized requirement validation workshops with users, with my subject matter experts, and with developers. Then I built a quick low fidelity prototype to confirm behaviors. And then I used acceptance criteria and process flows to clarify ambiguity. And then I documented and secured sign off. So, in summary, what I actually did here, and just to recap, is I had to go back to the stakeholders, and walk through the requirement that had initially been gathered. And then I use prototype, like I said, to make it clearer to the stakeholders. Some of these prototypes I used things like wireframe and some prototype tools to bring the requirements alive to the stakeholders. Once they were able to see this, it became easier for them to really clear off on any ambiguity, and we could sign off. The result was that we were able to get a sign off, and the development progressed smoothly. Change requests also reduced by 80%, and the new portal was launched with minimal defects. Can you describe a time when you introduced a new analytical or BA technique to improve your team's work? Yes. In my previous project, um, I was brought in as the lead BA. Now, the team struggled to prioritize features because decisions were based on opinions rather than a structured analysis. Part of my task in this project, actually in this organization, was to improve how we evaluated options and how the BA team worked as a whole. So what I did then was to introduce a decision matrix which compared cost, value, risk, and complexity. And then I used impact mapping to show how features link to business goals. And then I facilitated prioritization workshops to apply the new tools. The result was that this created transparency, and it allowed decisions to be made in 1 hour instead of days. And the team adopted the method for future projects. Can you tell me about a time when you helped turn around a failing project? Um, in one of my previous roles, which was a digital transformation project, this project was 3 months behind schedule, and we had unclear deliverables. My responsibilities was to stabilize the project through structured analysis, as this would help the project manager and the development team as well, to understand what was priority, and how the roadmap should be followed. So what I had to do there here was I reviewed all existing documentation and identified where we had scope creep. And then I rebuilt the backlog with clear user stories and acceptance criteria. I ensured I validated this with the stakeholders. And then I reprioritized scope with the product owner using the Moscow method, which stands for must have, should have, could have, and wouldn't have. And then, based on all of this, I set realistic milestones, improved communication channels, and I established daily touch points with the stakeholders as well as the developers. The result was that stakeholders gained clarity, the team regained momentum, and our minimum viable product was delivered on the revised timeline. Can you now also describe a time when you used insights from user behavior to improve a service or a product? Yes. Um, on a customer facing service portal, many users dropped out halfway through a critical process. That was the situation I found in this particular project. My task then there was to identify why users were abandoning the process and also propose improvements. Now, the actions I took to resolve this was I reviewed the analytics to identify drop-off points, and then I then conducted usability tests with real users to observe their behavior. And from observation, I was able to find out that instructions were unclear and the navigation was very confusing. Using all of this, I was able to identify the points where users had the most problems and where they normally dropped off. And then I worked with the UX and dev and development teams to streamline steps and to improve the process. The result was that com- completion rates increased by 35% within the first month, and customer satisfaction improved significantly. Um, in terms of a concluding remark for everyone watching this, it's important for you to understand that as a business analyst and when you have to do interview questions, sometimes you may prepare ahead for an interview and then you get given questions that you had not kind of prepared for. So it's very, very important as a business analyst. These are interview tips now. It's very, very important as a business analyst that you are very adaptable. Listen carefully to the question. Sometimes the questions may not relate directly to what you have prepared. But if you listen to the question properly, you will find out that normally you can relate them to your understanding of business analysis. Never forget that as a business analyst, you are there to be able to observe the current situation, observe where there are gaps, observe the kind of changes that you can bring you can bring in, and the fact that you need to be very adaptable. Once you hold these values, it will be easier for you to be able to read through questions, um, 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 receive them very, very quickly and adapt your answers. Even if you had pre-prepared answers, you can listen to these questions and quickly adapt them to the situation that you have been asked. If you review this question, you find out that some of the questions do not come across your classic questions where you get things like tell me how you dealt with a difficult stakeholder. But the fact is that many of the questions, for example, if you have to solve a difficult problem, for instance, you could always relate them to either that problem be one of dealing with a difficult stakeholder, or dealing with a communication issue. The key thing for you there is that you must be adaptable. Listen carefully to the questions and know how you can quickly adapt those questions to situations that you are familiar with. That will be all for this session. Um, Tune in for more publications and videos to help you on your journey as a business analyst. Until our next video, take care and keep studying.